Hello, Rush Nation, and welcome to the 5 Yard Dynasty podcast. I am your host today. There's no Rich. He is taking a well-earned holiday with his family. So I am your host, Liam, or at the FSA Tweets. And today I have a very special guest, one of our Dynasty writers. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of banter going back and forth with who we support. If you're watching the live stream, you can see the jerseys that we're wearing right now. So I'm not going to say any more than that. Lewis, how are you doing, mate?
I'm really good, thank you, mate. I've not been writing much recently because I recently had an ankle operation, but I actually took my first steps today. So even outside of the NFL Dynasty world, things are pretty good for me. And yeah, that's all I really want to talk about for the last week. Given the jerseys we've got on at the moment, I feel best to reflect on personal achievements more so than anything that our teams did.
Well, I won't bring it up if you won't, but all I'm going to say for those podcast listeners, obviously, you know I'm a Packers fan. Lewis is wearing a Rams jersey. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, the upsetting thing is obviously having I support a team that won even less games than Rich's team in November, and Rich is a Jets fan, and that's really saying something.
You said it, not me. I'm not taking the mickey. Right, so let's move on. So support to the 5 Yard Dynasty podcast is brought to you by Manscaped. So Rich is the one that normally does these ad reads. So Manscaped is the best in the below the waist grooming for men. We have an exclusive offer of 20% off and free worldwide shipping with the code 5Yard. And they've released the Lawnmower 4.0, where it's got 3 different length blades. It's got an LED light, and Rich raves about it. I just echo him. I don't normally need to say anything because he goes on about it so much, but I will echo him here. It is great. It's a game changer. It's something that I never really thought of until we got this product, and then just completely changed everything I think about down there. So 20% off, free worldwide shipping with the code 5Yard. So, cocktail of the week. Normally, I have Rich hand it over to me, so I'm going to have to do it to myself. So this is a hurricane. You do lime juice, orange juice, pineapple juice, rum, passion fruit liqueur, and syrup, and passion fruit syrup. Lewis, are you a massive cocktail drinker?
It sounds delicious. I'm normally just a very, very simple double whiskey with a couple of blocks of ice. So I think as far away as you can get from a cocktail, but also very, very happy to have one when it gets much further into the night. And I've had a few of something else in me, but that sounds delicious.
Honestly, try it. It's really easy to make. It's mostly equal parts as well. So it's really not a hard drink to make.
Yeah.
So moving on to the high scorers. This week, it was, I wouldn't say it's a down week, but we definitely didn't see eye-popping numbers from a lot of the usual suspects. So at the quarterback position, we had Josh Allen, Aaron Rodgers, and Dak Prescott. 3 names that you kind of expect to be around the top 5, top 3.
Yeah, and also kind of natural in terms of when you were looking at the games going in, there were games with quite high over-unders. The Bills less so, but I think Josh Allen has a bit of a pattern after lower games that he comes back with a vengeance. But then if you look at Dak's performance and Aaron Rodgers' performance, they were both sort of expected in games that we were expecting to be shootouts.
I mean, I'm glad you brought up Dak because last week I mentioned that I started Dak over Hurts, and Dak got me about 1 or 2 points while Hurts got 30. This week I did it the other way around, and look what happened this week. So that league, even though I've still won both matchups, it's not pretty.
No, well, I think it was still good. So looking back at the Chiefs game, because I did a similar thing in terms of starting a few, or basically any Cowboys option that I had. I have a league where I have the Dak Amari stack. I can't remember if Amari was still healthy for the Chiefs game, but either way, like you get very, very excited going into these big matchups, but actually just because it doesn't go the way it was supposed to doesn't mean that it was the wrong process.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Rich consoled me with that sentiment, so I'll just echo it again.
Yeah.
I'll keep that. So moving on to the running back position. Remember, this is PPR for every position. You've got Leonard Fournette had an absolutely monster week. 5 touchdowns, 4 touchdowns, 4 touchdowns.
4 touchdowns, but a couple of them in the air, which is really interesting that we weren't expecting this kind of a season from Fournette. And I think last season, we saw people really scrambling to try and think who would be the back to own in the Tampa Bay backfield. This season, it felt like coming into the year, even though we obviously had playoff Lenny, it felt like coming into the year, people went, I don't want any shares in this. I don't want to be part of the issue. And especially when they brought in Gio Bernard, and we thought, okay, so the early down work, who knows what's going to end up happening. But Leonard Fournette is now the running back 5 in PPR. And he has had kind of a monster last few weeks, but he's really, really taken the sharehold of that work. And especially given Ronald Jones has scored touchdowns the last 2 weeks as well. Gio Bernard is barely seeing the field now, but Leonard Fournette has the stranglehold of the passing down work. He's shown, obviously, pass protection a big thing for Tom Brady, but that's going to be a really high scoring team, aside from occasionally when they play the Saints, which seems to be his kryptonite. But Leonard Fournette's a really exciting option at the moment. And talking Dynasty, even though he's the running back 5, I think you're in a similar situation with the Cordero Patterson type, that I think you can still get him pretty cheap. I think you can get him for a late 1 or perhaps even an early 2. So a real buy if you're heading into playoffs and maybe you've suffered from one of the running back injuries that we're going to come on into in a minute.
Yeah, definitely. I think if your trade deadline hasn't passed, Leonard Fournette is definitely an option. Maybe buying after this week is not going to be as cheap as he was the week prior to the week, but definitely prior to the week, it was seeming that Fournette, the value wasn't really there with his production.
Yeah.
So, like otherwise in the running back position, we had Joe Mixon having another great game. He's really putting on an absolute show this season. And then Elijah Mitchell, what a week for him. Me and Rich have always said, if you know who the running back 1 in that backfield is going to be, you start them, but no one ever knows, and that's the issue. But Elijah Mitchell, absolutely great. Moving on to the wide receiver position, we've got Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins, and then Adam Thielen. Thielen having a 2-touchdown game. All he seems to do is catch touchdowns and then not a whole lot else.
Yeah, and it's the classic kind of Mike Evans stat line that we're used to. But Adam Thielen coming into this year, a lot of people were fading him. I think that, the phrase touchdown regression is something which is really bandied about. And kind of understandably, because we know that that's what happens. We know that touchdowns aren't a sticky stat. Maybe for Adam Thielen, they are. I'm just trying to find.
I mean, talking
10,
about
10 on the year.
That's the same as Mike Evans. I saw Mike Evans had 10 this year, and everyone seems to believe that Mike Evans is just a touchdown machine. So I don't see why that doesn't translate to Thielen. Mm-hmm. Thielen showed the past 2 years he is a red zone monster. And when you've got Justin Jefferson on the other side, and then we'll come on to this in a little bit, but Dalvin Cook in the backfield, you've got 3 elite options that you've got to prepare for. And you can't just leave a tight end running across the middle of the field or even 2. So
yeah, and it's really something to be said as well for being the quarterback's favorite read or first read in the end zone. That is very clearly the case for Kirk Cousins, that the first thing he does is to look where Adam Thielen is. And if you're as proficient as he is in red zone targets, he's going to end up getting a lot of scores. They're a team with a pretty prolific offense and a not so fantastic defense, and that's kind of fantasy gold.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I was on Adam Thielen coming into the year, knowing that it was more of a buy now, and you're probably not going to get the same value coming out of the season. But if you contend in, Adam Thielen is definitely helping you.
Yeah, I actually sold him before the season in a Dynasty league where I'm now 11-1. and the price wasn't something I'm particularly happy with at this point,
Ouch.
especially given we were just talking about, because it was what's now projected to be 205 or 204, somewhere around there, and Ronald Jones. And it was because I didn't really have any running back depth, and I fell into the trap of maybe Ronald Jones will take a bit more of the work. Good
That's
price
not
before the season, but
exactly. As you said, the process was there. It is difficult to see. I don't think anyone really projected Ronald Jones being in the doghouse for 90% of this season so far.
no.
Moving on to the tight ends, we've got Jack Doyle, who was probably on your waiver wire. And if you had him on your lineup, how active have you been this season? Yeah, Jack Doyle, tight end 1, Rob Gronkowski, tight end 2. He didn't score a touchdown, I don't think, but he definitely got all those targets. And then Dawson Knox as the tight end 3. Dawson Knox having an absolutely great season, Lewis.
Yeah, Dawson Knox is breaking out the way that we sort of hope tight ends to do towards the third or fourth year. And that's actually something which I think is interesting to talk about from the Dynasty perspective, is sort of Kyle Pitts aside, and actually Frymouth is having an unbelievable rookie season, kind of going a little bit unnoticed just because the focus is on Pitts, as it was justifiably around draft time. But we always talk about kind of breakout age and when we expect players to really explode into fantasy relevancy. And we know with the tight end position that it normally takes a few extra years, especially to learn the position. It's very complicated, but also to bulk up in the way that you can actually be a proficient blocker in the NFL. So if you're a proper tight end and not a Kyle Pitts, Mike Gesicki type, where you actually play more wide receiver than anything else, you're more of a big slot. It does take a while to learn the position, but in Dynasty, people who aren't so used to Dynasty, they expect instant production from every player that they have on their roster, and you may be unwilling to have someone sit there and go, okay, I've picked up this rookie tight end. I picked up Brevin Jordan in the rookie draft this year in the 4th. He's not doing anything, I'll drop him. Well, actually, that was a bad process, because you should have drafted him knowing I'm going to have to sit this person on my roster for 3 years. What you can do instead, obviously, taxi squads are quite useful here, but what I quite like to do actually is to try and take advantage of that if there's been quite a low rookie year for a tight end, see if you can buy low on them. You probably would have been able to buy Dawson Knox this offseason for what, a third?
At a push.
Yeah.
I think most people would have taken maybe 2/4 or just a throw-in player, someone like Van Jefferson. I'm probably sure a lot of people would have taken your deal on there. So I know Van Jefferson has been doing well this season, but I echo everything you've just said. Dawson Knox, for me, I mentioned him kind of like a tongue-in-cheek mention at the start of the season when we were talking about tight ends breaking out and who we like for the season, purely based on his profile and coming into his 3rd year. I think with Knox specifically, you've got a lot of talent there, and it's a great offense. But he is more of an exception to the rule. He's kind of like what Tunyon and Logan Thomas did last year, where they went really undrafted and then all of a sudden have become mainstays. And I can see, even though Dawson Knox isn't doing as well as those two are now or did last year, I don't think you're going to see Dawson Knox drafted as highly. But yeah, this is the sort of thing I talk about when we come around to rookie season, is don't draft a tight end in the rookie draft unless it's something like a Kyle Pitts or someone. For example, I drafted Noah Fant in my first year in both of my dynasty leagues, and that's done well. But I'd rather have spent my 2nd round pick on something else looking back on it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't draft tight ends in the 3rd or 4th. Go for a random running back like Rich always mentions, and then you'll get instant return. And most likely by their 3rd year, you're picking them off waivers anyway.
Exactly. And it's sort of a known thing that every single year you will have a breakout tight end off the waiver wire. And it's everything that you don't like about the fantasy position, is that it can be entirely random. Sort of summarized by the fact that Jack Doyle was the tight end 1 this week. And as we, this seems to be a process-themed show. If you started Jack Doyle in fantasy this week, that was bad process. It might have worked out, but that was desperation if you were having to start him. There's no real way of projecting it at all. That in terms of then picking someone up off the wire, you spoke about obviously Tunyon and Logan Thomas. Darren Waller was a huge waiver wire ad when he first initially broke out. Even Mark Andrews came off the waiver wire. It really seems like this is how the position is going to continue to shake out. You're going to have a few elite options at the top, although they seem to be dropping like flies. And then aside from that, it's whoever you can pick up. And, it's a redraft strategy, but I really told myself going into my redraft leagues this year, if I wasn't getting one of my top 3 or 4, I was drafting them with my last pick because I have no interest in those middle round tight ends ever.
I did the same in some of my Dynasty startups this year. If I didn't get the top 3 or 4, I was looking at just punting the position. I think in one of my leagues, I punted until the 17th round or something, just because I didn't want to take anyone as highly as they were. I think I got CJ Uzomah, who's been fine. He's
there you go.
I liked him going into last season. He showed a bit and then got injured. And it's not like it's not like I knew CJ Uzomah was going to break out, but he's done well for where I drafted him. Tight end 33, I think he was. You don't need to be spending that draft capital, in my opinion. I'd rather take a wide receiver where you're taking your tight end 6-7.
Exactly. And it's always about looking at kind of the where you can slot in and see if you're drafting Travis Kelce at the back of the 1, he's going to finish as the running back 3 or the wide receiver 3 in PPR leagues. If you're drafting a tight end in the middle rounds, you're drafting someone who probably would be finishing as the wide receiver 60, somewhere around there. Would you be playing them in your flex spot if you could? No.
That is precisely why I punted so far in a lot of leagues. So after Lewis has got me on a tight end rant again, I'm sure that was his only goal of coming on the podcast this week.
Yeah.
Let's move on to some significant news. What are you going to say? Sorry, Lewis.
I was just going to say it's distracting you from the Rams-Packers game. That's really the aim.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I won't bring it up if you won't, but as you did, the Packers did win, and I'm very happy about it. So, significant news. We have a plethora of running back news, which is never good. But as you should probably know by now from me and Rich always talking about it, running backs get injured a lot more than any other position. So, I'm not saying it's going to be like this every week, because obviously it hasn't if you go through the season, but it's definitely not been good. So, first of all, Dalvin Cook dislocated his shoulder during the game. He's potentially out for 3 weeks. Keep an eye on it, because that shoulder is not good for Dalvin Cook. He's re-injured it multiple times, so just make sure you keep an eye out on that. Christian McCaffrey is headed back to IR, which means he's done for the season. He came out of the game and he was in a walking boot, so he's back to IR. That's an immense loss for everyone, not only for obviously the player himself, but the Panthers, and an absolute massive loss for anyone that was trying to contend. I know that I'm trying to contend in one league where I sent Elijah Moore and a first for Christian McCaffrey, and luckily it got declined. But I suppose I'll preface that with the first is on the borderline of playoffs. So if he didn't make the playoffs, it would have been something like the 103.
Okay.
So it would have been worth it. But then if they did make the playoffs, it was going to be 107, 108. So I'm not saying it was a great offer, just making sure that people don't think I'm trying to rip people off. But Christian McCaffrey out for the season.
It's really, really horrible news, but it really fits into everything that we've spoken about the dangers of still holding older running backs. Christian McCaffrey is a really interesting one because he's sort of managed to avoid the injury-prone label that other backs with similar injury history have taken on. He's really missed as much time as Saquon Barkley the last couple of years. Now, obviously, Barkley's MCL tear last year is a harder injury to come back from than McCaffrey's, which was, I think, repeated hamstring injuries last year. So it is a more difficult one to recover from. But he managed to sort of avoid the injury-prone label coming in. He was still going at the top of drafts, and Saquon was sneaking to the back of the first, even into the second. If I'm holding CMC in any league where I have him, just because you're not going to get anywhere near value at the moment. Unfortunately, the sort of teams that will own CMC, unless they're exceptionally well built, will normally have CMC as their really one prime asset, because you have to give up. If you didn't draft him, you had to give up so much to get him. You know, we talk about the sort of prices you're seeing for JT at the moment. That was even higher for CMC a few years ago. That may potentially, and well, definitely has ruined a few people's seasons that he's been out. If you've not passed trade deadlines, and I actually don't particularly like them, so anything I commission doesn't have them. If I'm rebuilding, I'm probably offering something for him now, and it's going to be absolutely nothing, but just to see. If I'm in a league where I'm rebuilding and the contending team has CMC, I'm going in with James Conner in a first, Leonard Fournette in a first, something that's going to give them that running back to help them this season, because at this point, they're probably so knee-deep into playoffs in that they're going to now be panicking that they're going to go out first round. Can you see if you can exploit that as a rebuilding manager? And then potentially, my plan definitely, if I were to do that, would then be to sell CMC early next season when he starts to explode again, as we know he will.
I mean, CMC, he's in the top 8 in points per game.
Yeah.
I saw a tweet yesterday where it said something along the lines of Christian McCaffrey's only had just over 650 rushing yards on the season. I'm like, that's great, but let me have a look at the stats. So when I looked, he has another 500 receiving, which took him up to 1,150 total scrimmage yards in 10 games.
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous.
I believe it was even less than 10 games if you take the snaps. He had over 1,000 scrimmage yards in 10 games. That's crazy for someone, especially a running back. Yeah. Anyway, we'll move on. So DeAndre Swift, not Hopkins, Swift. He left the game with a shoulder injury, again, 2 to 3 weeks. Darren Waller has a knee injury. He left the game and didn't return after half time, but he's likely back next week. I think you need to keep an eye on this, Lewis, but he could be out this week. I'm hoping he's back, and I think reports are trending that way, but I think the Raiders might be a bit more skeptical about bringing him back.
Yeah. The reason I've highlighted this one as a Darren Waller owner in quite a lot of my leagues, actually, when I looked at shares, I think I own him in 5 out of 8. And Darren Waller is one of the only tight ends that I kind of consider handcuffing. The Raiders have shown that when Waller has missed time, they use Foster Moreau in a very similar way, and especially right now when the Raiders don't really have any other sort of premium red zone threat. Tight ends are pretty much only good for red zone targets if they're not a volume play, as about 3 or 4 of them are. If I own Waller, I'm probably looking to pick up Moreau off waivers, and I'm kind of happy starting him if Waller ends up missing time. I think if you're a Waller owner, you're probably happy with him missing 1 week, so long as you don't desperately need to win this week to make playoffs, because you'd be happier to have him for 4 playoffs than for him to re-aggravate this week.
Yeah, but as we've spoken about the tight end position, you could probably pick someone off waivers who's going to be the tight end one. So
Jack Doyle.
Exactly. So AJ Brown, rib contusion. He is on IR, out for 3 games, which includes this week because it is their Titans bye week. So he's out for the next 4 weeks, the next 3 games. The Titans' offense has been decimated. They've lost Julio Jones. Julio Jones hasn't really played. AJ Brown's been in and out, and then they obviously lost Derrick Henry earlier in the season for the rest of potentially this season. I know that there was talk about him coming back for the real NFL playoffs, but yeah, that offense has just been decimated. So Ryan Tannehill now is throwing to Josh Reynolds, I believe, is on the Titans.
No, it's on the Lions now. He was
on
cut.
the line.
So even worse than Josh Reynolds.
Yeah, so who would have been there?
Marcus
first?
Johnson, I think,
There
is
you go,
one.
Marcus Johnson.
Is one.
Yeah.
I can't remember. It says a lot that two people as in the know as us can't remember.
Exactly, that's the point. But yeah, I think the AJ Brown injury opens up a little bit of a buy window. I know that he's not been great this season, but maybe there's a little bit of a buy window. I know he's definitely dropped in people's dynasty rankings.
Yeah, and I think you've got at the moment a group of young studs. Your Chasers, your Lambs, your DKs, your Jeffersons, and AJ Brown was the fifth in that group, and is really starting to drop off in people's rankings. The injuries are one thing that you really have to take into account, but it should give you a nice window that you can buy him at a price that you won't be able to buy any of the others. Maybe an early first gets him now, as opposed to 3 early firsts getting the others.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. So just looking at the wide receiver ones for good podcasting, we should tell the listeners who they are. So Chester Rogers, who I believe was cut from the Colts last season, or was just let go in free agency. Des Fitzpatrick, the rookie, and Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, who I believe is also a rookie. Oh no, he's got 1 year under his belt. So
they did. They did actually just sign Golden Tate. He wasn't. He's on the practice squad now. So if you're desperate,
if he needs to, but
yeah. So I suppose Golden Tate could be their wide receiver one, but it's not exactly the excitement we had for AJ Brown and Julio Jones.
No, definitely not. So over in Chicago, Justin Fields has a rib fracture. So we know that they were looking into a potential rib bruise. And we thought he was going to be back this week, and that seems to have changed, and they did actually find a fracture eventually. So he's potentially out 2 to 3 weeks. Andy Dalton's taking over there. Ezekiel Elliott, knee bruise, out for potentially 3 weeks. Dan Arnold has hit IR. I know that me and Rich spoke about that, about Dan Arnold, I believe it was last week or the week before. He's hit IR with an MCL sprain, so he's out for 3 weeks. And then Deebo Samuel came out from the game after having an immense season. He's potentially out for 2 to 4 weeks. That's someone that is probably helping contenders contend and get to those playoffs, and they potentially lose him going into the first week of playoffs, maybe in 2 weeks' time. So that's someone that you need to keep an eye on. Bye weeks, we're looking at Green Bay, the Cleveland Browns, the Carolina Panthers, and as we've already mentioned, the Tennessee Titans.
Yeah, a lot of premium options that you're going to be missing right now. I just wanted to actually to bring us back to Deebo. I'd be really interested to know, because I was thinking about him recently, and it was because I was thinking about just rejigging my rankings as we approach the end of the season. What sort of price would you be willing to buy Deebo Samuel for right now?
I'd probably be cheeky and max go first and second, but I'm not looking to buy that offense because we're going to see Trey Lance next year. I know that Kyle Shanahan did leave the door open for Garoppolo to start next year, although I don't think that's happening.
No.
I just don't know how Trey Lance is going to run that offense. And yes, I agree that Shanahan will always get the ball into his playmakers' hands, and Deebo Samuel has been their most dynamic playmaker. But I just wonder how much of the ball Deebo is going to see. Maybe it turns out that Deebo does help in the long run with such a low ADOT that he already has. Lance needs that low ADOT, along with Kittle being around a low ADOT as well, or lowish ADOT. So potentially Deebo even helps Lance, but like I said at the start of the season, I don't like that offense for trying to pick out who's going to be a boom week. We thought it was going to be Kittle coming into the season. Obviously, that's now Deebo. So I'm probably going first and second, and that's probably a little bit cheeky. People are probably looking for 2 firsts.
Yeah, I think I agree. I've really got these images in my head of the old triple option that I used to like running on Madden as a kid with Trey Lance in the middle, Debo on one side, and Elijah Mitchell on the other. But no, I think I agree, and that's the sort of why I wanted to ask, is because I still feel. I mean, I don't like buying players who have jumped in the middle of the season, who have exploded, because you're just buying at peak value, and that's not the way I like to run things. Like, I'm more likely to be selling Cooper Kupp right now than I am to be buying him. But that's sort of why I wanted to ask, because I don't think if I if I had an early first, which not to brag, I don't have many of, I don't know if I'd be willing to send an early first for Devo, and I think I'm wrong. I think that is his value, that you'd be looking for 2 firsts for him. But yeah, it still worries me that I think this might be the high for him, as opposed to this being the new normal.
Yeah, I do think that this is a high, but if you're not sending at least a first, or potentially an early first, you're probably not getting him at this point. So
yeah.
So let's move on, Lewis. Dynasty stock market. We'll start with the risers as usual. A guy that you wanted to speak about, who I thought was an absolutely great guy to start talking about, is Kendrick Bourne. So he's the wide receiver 25 overall on the season, but he's the wide receiver 39 in points per game. So I just think that's a crazy stat line for any person to have. I mean, you tend to see them within 5 to 10 spots between their overall season and their points per game, but to see him drop 14 spots, I think that's a massive drop. But I do like him. I just don't see him being the number one target over in New England. Can you sell me a little bit more on Kendrick Bourne?
So the reason why I wanted to talk about Kendrick Bourne is less as this is the player to buy that's going to be the new wide receiver 1 on your dynasty team, but more if you're playing in a PPR league, which is what we always talk about. Kendrick Bourne is a really solid floor play for your wide receiver 3 position. We are seeing a huge difference between beginning of the season Kendrick Bourne and then the recent weeks. So I noted here that since week 7, there's only been 1 game that he's had under 4 receptions. And I know none of these stat lines are going to absolutely blow you away, because if they were blowing you away, I wouldn't have to sell you on him. But Mac Jones is really starting to come into his own running in the offense. We're seeing a really, really stable pocket presence from him. He's really good at just distributing the ball to his playmakers. And he's starting to show a connection with Bourne that I don't think we're seeing between him and any other of the wide receivers. The Patriots spent weird money on the wide receiver position in free agency. Nelson Aguilar is really not doing anything. Jacoby Myers is there, who is the leader in targets, but I don't think is dynamic in the same way that Kendrick Bourne is. Kendrick Bourne has a really, really good spectacular catchability, as we see every couple of games from him, but is actually finding his way in the red zone a little bit as well. So with kind of a stable floor of receptions that we've seen recently, along with some touchdown upside, he's actually a really solid wide receiver 3. And he's in the similar range at the moment as players like Darnell Mooney and Devonta Smith. And I know obviously he's older, it's a different situation. But he's not really being spoken about for fantasy at all. And he's been performing really, really well for fantasy, especially the last few weeks. And I think it's someone that, in terms of looking at the dynasty stock market, is a riser that I would be willing to send maybe a late 2 for, an early 3, because you could definitely buy him for that. And most people, he was a waiver wire pickup. And if you're struggling for sort of stability at the wide receiver position, you can do much worse than him as your wide receiver 3.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I saw a trade go down in one of my leagues where someone picked up a Kendrick Bourne share who's contending, and I love that for flex, for like an extra flex play if you need to cover a bye week or an injury. So I'm with you on that. Let's move on to Antonio Gibson. He had 111 rushing yards and 35 in the air. He's the RB21 in points per game and the RB17 overall. So the one thing that I've really noticed about him is when he has great games, I see a lot of people, especially on Twitter, saying, "Oh, Antonio Gibson's brilliant." But when he has not great games, has like poor games, I don't see that slating of him like you tend to see. It's kind of like the opposite of Kendrick Bourne.
Yeah.
You tend not to see anything about Kendrick Bourne in general, but for Gibson, you don't see the praise, or you see the praise, you don't see anything else. I think with that Washington offense, it's really up and down. I spoke last week about Terry McLaurin having really up and down season. And just to give you a bit of an idea, listeners, Antonio Gibson has had either single digit games or games around circa 20 points. There's no in between. I think the lowest double digit game he's got is 15 points in PPR. So I think Gibson, although he's a riser because people have seen him have 2 great weeks out of the past 3, I think I'm starting to reevaluate how I view Gibson because he's got 5 double-digit games on the season, and that's it out of 12 weeks.
Yeah, and it's not what you expect for the price that you had to pay for him in the offseason. And especially, we had that group of second-year backs this year who have really either boomed or busted, or I suppose got very injured. And you sort of expect that explosion from Gibson. And we have, like you say, we have seen it in some weeks, but we've not seen the consistency that you really want to have from your RB1. And I think I really like Gibson. I really like the talent, and maybe usage is some of it. But I don't think you're seeing the level of consistency that I would want to see from my running back one.
No, I think this is where I'm kind of at right now with Gibson. He is a solid RB2, probably where we're looking, or for me anyway, probably where we're looking at Clyde Edwards-Helaire before the season.
Yeah,
I think that's probably where I value him right now. Let's move on to the fallers, Lewis. So ones that I put on here, I kind of put them together to group them up a little bit because they're in the same kind of category for me. One's doing worse than the other. And if Richard was around, I would be digging a little bit of a hole with him. But yeah, let's start with Trevor Lawrence and Zach Wilson as a group. We can split them up if you want. But Trevor Lawrence, for example, he is the QB 22 on the year, but the QB 35 in points per game.
Yeah.
And then Zach Wilson is the QB 31 in points per game, and the QB 35. Sorry, I got Trevor Lawrence mixed up. It's 22 points per game, 38 in. No, ignore that, listeners. I've messed up my notes, so I won't be cutting that out because I don't want to do the editing. So let's start that again. Trevor Lawrence and Zach Wilson. Trevor Lawrence, QB 22, and then QB 35 in points per game, and then QB 31 for Zach Wilson, and QB 38 in points per game. Now, can you start talking so I don't keep digging myself a hole that I might need to edit later?
No problem at all.
For me, they both need to improve, and I can see them improving with better rosters. But right now, I just see those talent-deprived rosters and don't think there's an end in sight at the moment.
Yeah, so and I do kind of like both of them as fallers in terms of if we're looking specifically at value, the value of both is significantly fallen. I was actually pretty out on Zach Wilson. Even so far back as pre-draft, I was in on Trevor Lawrence. Everyone was in on Trevor Lawrence. That doesn't really mean anything. But I think the difference between both of them for me in terms of, I think Trevor Lawrence's value is dropping because he's not come in and been the same, the absolute golden boy of the NFL that we were expecting to see right away. But I think a lot of that has to do with situation. When you sit back and watch film, you see wide receivers gaining no separation. You see terribly schemed up plays. You see a lot of drops from them as well, and just things being put together in a way that you wouldn't necessarily do to help rookie quarterbacks. So I think Trevor Lawrence, I can see the path to him becoming Trevor Lawrence again. I think it happens when Urban Meyer takes a college job this offseason with, I think, North Dakota State Notre Dame has just opened up. So maybe Urban Meyer leaves to go and take that, and then they can bring in an actual NFL coach. Zach Wilson, I'm much lower on. Zach Wilson, I think what I'm seeing from him, especially, obviously, we've seen him live at the London games as well. This is a very reductive way of putting it, but it seems to me like it's more his fault. I'm seeing him escaping pretty safe pockets pretty early on. I actually quite like the Jets' offensive line, especially the left side with Vera Tucker and Becton. And I like a few of the Jets' weapons. I really like Elijah Moore. I'm quite a big Corey Davis fan as well. So I think there's better weapons there than we're seeing in Jacksonville. But what I'm seeing from Zach Wilson is a kid who has been the most talented player on the field anytime he's played, and kind of still thinks he is. So you're seeing him trying to make plays that when they come off, amazing. He looks like Patrick Mahomes in the way that people wanted him to. When they don't come off, he gets picked 7 times by the Patriots, I think it was. I'm normally, when a rookie underproduces, I'm quite happy to buy at that low cost. I just bought Terrace Marshall for quite cheap with Zach Wilson, because what I'm seeing on the field I'm not liking, and I'm not 100% sure I have faith in the organization to develop him. I'm sort of staying away as much as possible.
We'll put the record right for the listeners. It was 4 interceptions against the Patriots. I know you probably were exaggerating a little bit. But I don't want to say that he's worse than what was his name? Nathan Peterman, is it?
Nathan Peterman,
the Bills, when he threw so many. Yeah, that was an awful game, but we'll move on from that. So Zach Wilson, I think with a first-year head coach and such a talent-deprived roster in general, I think that a lot has been put on his shoulders. And like you said, he's kind of going back to the safe place, in quotation marks, I suppose, that during his career so far, he has been one of the most talented, if not the most talented player on the field on his team. So he's always been the one to bail out teams, whereas in the NFL, he's hopefully very quickly learning that it doesn't work unless you're someone like an Aaron Rodgers, who took a year. Let's not forget, Aaron Rodgers didn't start for the first 3 years, and he still took quite a bit of time to get used to getting into the game and doing what he does now. Same with Russ Wilson. Wilson didn't start and just immediately become this scrambling quarterback that does everything that you expect him to do. With Lawrence, I'm more in on buying Lawrence, but as you said, the price is higher. I think with Lawrence, you've seen the offense, and you're kind of wondering who the wide receiver one is there, because Marvin Jones, really, he's their leading wide receiver, and I know a lot of people were touting him as the wide receiver 3. DJ Chark has been injured, and then Laviska Shenault, who a lot of people were pretty high on, hasn't done anything at all. Yes, you lost Etienne, who would have been able to essentially play a Kyle Pitts role where he moved into the slot a lot more, but they lost him as well. They had to trade for Dan Arnold, and he's been the talk of Jacksonville for the past 2 weeks, and then he's been injured. So I think Lawrence, you probably see a new head coach next year. As you said, maybe Urban Meyer does move back to the college scene with the whole Lincoln Riley move and jobs potentially opening up left, right, and centre there now. But Lawrence, I think it's a great time to buy him. But I do wonder what people would be willing to sell him for, because of the high draft capital people put into him. I don't think a lot of them will want to give up.
No, and
whereas Wilson, I think that people are a lot more ready to give up on him. One, because he's been worse, but two, because you probably didn't have to put as much into him. He was probably the quarterback 4, if not the quarterback 5 in a lot of rookie startups or rookie drafts.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I'd be really interested to see. I really hope that DJ Chark ends up, because he's a free agent this year, ends up taking a team-friendly deal for a year and then resetting based off the injury year, because they seem to have a quite nice connection in the first game and a half that Chark managed to get through. I think that a lot of the problem for Lawrence is genuinely he played with better talent in college than he's playing with now. Throwing to T. Higgins as well. Like T. Higgins would be the clear wide receiver 1 on Jacksonville. And I think if they can spend some draft capital and some money in free agency, it's a pretty good wide receiver class.
Let's not forget my boy Amari Rogers was on that offense. Come on.
Yeah, Amari Rogers, who is a absolute fumble machine
at the moment, yes,
for the Packers.
I don't think it's him. I think it's whoever is catching the ball on special teams is just prone to fumbling. The whole special teams is cursed right now for the Packers.
Yes.
I will say DJ Chark is a free agent next year, so maybe we don't see that connection. But I do expect the Jags to come into free agency and spend a lot of money, and if not capital as well. So let's move on to someone that you put onto the list, Lewis. Tj Hawkinson. It just seems like you want to start me off and try tight end rants all the way through this episode. So he's the tight end 3 or the tight end 6 in points per game. I don't know where you want to start with Tj Hawkinson, because he's doing okay, but if you look at his actual scores, I don't think he's returning the investment that you probably put in.
And that's the key thing for me, is the return on investment. Tj Hawkinson for me was coming into the season, obviously having the pretty set in stone top 3. Kyle Pitts, I'm going to put separately in a tier of his own. Hawk was who I was looking at, especially because as a Rams fan, I've seen Jared Goff succeed. I've seen him do well. I've seen him perform as a pretty, average Andy Dalton style quarterback that you can win with. Obviously, he's not playing up to that, but Hawk was the clear and only receiving threat in the team, aside from obviously Swift out the backfield. So we thought, Hawk can have a 50% target share, or that's exaggerating, but genuinely no reason why he couldn't be up in the high 30s. And we thought that he would be able to explode a little bit more into, a PPR weapon. You like tight ends who were the number 1 or number 2 target on their offense. That was clearly going to be the case with Hawk. And when you now look at that return on investment, he hasn't been bad, but he's been really propped up by touchdowns in the bigger games. So obviously started off really well, but there were touchdowns in both games. Followed that up with weeks 3 to 5 with lower than 10 points in each game. And he's been sort of bouncing around the 10-point mark, which you can't really complain about at the tight end position in PPR. But the issue for me is the price that you put in compared to the output that you're getting currently, and then the future output as well. The dead cap for Jared Goff is somewhere around 25 million, I believe. He's going to be on the roster next year. And in terms of then, obviously, they do have the draft capital maybe to trade for a quarterback. I can't see that they will, because the roster isn't anywhere near close enough. I think they're probably going to be taking a quarterback with the Rams pick and then setting him for a year. I don't think you're going to be getting the return on Hawkinson anytime soon. So that's why he's a faller for me, because I think it's about the optimism before the season and the price you'll have had to pay for him when you had to draft him compared to what you're getting currently, but then what the outlook is looking like for next season as well. I can't see the Lions offense improving at all.
As usual for me, top tight ends are probably a sell more so than not. But yeah, if you find someone that is just looking at the overall stats on the season, you're probably getting a much better price than what he's actually giving you in production.
Yeah.
So moving on, Lewis, we've got DK Metcalf is the other person you wanted to talk about. So wide receiver 21 on the season and wide receiver 24 in points per game. Basically copy and paste what I've said about AJ Brown. in this section, but take away the injury news and probably put it more on a little bit of production and injury for his quarterback.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a similar thing in terms of the return on investment and the price that you might still get for DK Metcalf. But part of the elite price for DK Metcalf wasn't just his production. It was Russell being tied to Russell Wilson for his career. That now looks like it might not be the case, whether it's just because Russell Wilson might not be elite anymore, or whether it's because Russ is going to move elsewhere. We're seeing that, DK's a threat to take it to the house whenever he touches the ball, but I think he's dropped beyond the tier that I spoke about earlier of those young elite weapons. I think he's clearly dropped below those. He's quite difficult to even consider starting at the moment, just because he's had, like one reception in the last couple of games, or in the last game, and then 4 the week before, 3 the week before that. He's quite difficult to start, and that's not what you want to be getting from someone that you had to draft. Back of the first, early second?
I just think it's a massive fall from grace, considering that a lot of talk around DK last year was he's the new wide receiver 1 in Dynasty. And you're probably seeing what we saw with AJ Brown. So I think that he definitely is a faller and has been falling for the past couple of weeks. Yeah. So let's move on then, Lewis, to the stars of the week. We've got I decided to go with Mac Jones this week. He had an absolutely great game, and this is probably me looking at film more than actual fantasy production, because he only scored 20 points or 21 points this week, which is the highest score he's had all year. He's not had over 20 points for any game this year, which to me is crazy for someone that is being talked about so much. He had 32 attempts for 23 completions, 310 air yards, and 2 touchdowns in the air. And then he also had 2 rushing attempts for 11 yards. So that's basically menial. But he had an absolutely great game in the air. He was the QB6 on the week, which goes to show if he's only just getting over 20 points on or in the game, and he was the QB6, that goes to show what type of week it was this week for the QB position, at least. But going forward, I like Mac Jones. I just think that the hype is getting a little bit too far from what I would see as a limited ceiling player.
I inquired in a rebuild a couple of weeks ago and was quoted Amari Cooper and a late first.
Wow.
So, no.
I know that giving up or getting a quarterback without giving up one is always a tough deal in Superflex, but I think you could probably get a better deal for your late first alone. You could probably go out and get someone like a Baker Mayfield right now.
Yeah.
Who is probably going to be there for another year at least. I know he's not a sexy pick, but he'll at least tide you by. Yeah. But let's move on, Lewis. Your wide receiver or your player of the week.
Yeah, so I've gone for Michael Gallup, who I thought was really interesting listening to the show last week. Was someone you'd spoken about a lot. And I just really like when a player comes in with a lot of expectations. He's a huge waiver pickup. He's, Lamb's out, Cooper's out. It's a game with a higher over under. Everyone's starting Gallup and thinking this is the audition for him going forwards. And he showed what he could do. He had 8 targets, 5 receptions, 106 yards. There was a very big miss from Dak in the end zone, which definitely should have been a touchdown. But he led the Cowboys in receiving yards. Should have had a touchdown as well. And even though he's about to return to 3rd on the depth chart, it was a great audition for what he's going to be doing next year in free agency. Really interested to talk about and to see as we head towards the offseason where the landing spot might be. Maybe actually having just spoken about the Lions, having just spoken about the Jags, those could be some interesting spots for him. Because they're very wide receiver needy, but there's a lot of wide receiver needy teams in the league. But I just think in terms of a star of the week for me, it's great when someone is hyped up as a waiver option and they perform to exactly what you need from them.
Yeah, I think, although I don't expect Gallup to go away and be a wide receiver 1 next year for any team, I think having Gallup as a wide receiver 2 is absolutely brilliant, and then the Cowboys having him as a wide receiver 3 is insane. So I really do like him as not a buy low right now because of the type of game he's had. Maybe look in a couple of weeks' time if your trade deadline doesn't pass, or you don't have a trade deadline, which is what I want in all of my leagues. I had a passionate rant late last night in one of my leagues because the commish basically said it's non-negotiable. We're having a trade deadline. I was like, okay, but why? I wasn't expecting to change the decision. I was just trying to figure out why people want a trade deadline so much.
Yeah.
And it's the only reason I could find was because the NFL has one. And I may have got a bit pedantic and I said, why not have 32 teams and 54 plus rosters and 53-man rosters and stuff. But that's a whole other argument that we're not going to have time for this week. Michael Gallup specifically, I'd love him as a buy in the next couple of weeks if you can get him, maybe after this week, because he's boom bust when the Cowboys have all of their options.
Yeah.
So deep dive of the week, Lewis. We wanted to talk about Elijah Mitchell. He had an absolutely great game. We have touched on him, so we won't spend too much time on him. But he had 27 rushing attempts for 133 yards and a touchdown. And not only that, he also got passing game work. He got 5 receptions for 35 yards. Are we seeing a new running back one in San Fran?
Well, I think it's quite an interesting one. If Trey Sermon was performing the way that Eli Mitchell has been performing, we'd be talking about him as a top 12 dynasty running back. The draft capital still scares me. Because we've seen recently, Philip Lindsay, James Robinson, that even when you have a low capital back that performs, teams are still kind of guided by draft capital, as opposed to we would think you go, okay, you've managed to get a running back really cheap. Brilliant. That's what everyone wants, but they don't seem to be acting that way. But Kyle Shanahan has really shown an indication to ride the hot hand, and it seems like Eli Mitchell has established himself as the running back one there. I think we can really thank the O-line and particularly Trent Williams for that. I always love to give a shout out to the big guys. My brother's an O-line coach and I'm a big guy myself, so I always appreciate them. Trent Williams is playing at what should be an offensive player of the year pace, but he doesn't play a position where they're ever given credit, so he's never going to win it. But in the run game, he's been an absolute monster. And Eli Mitchell has shown a lot of patience in his running, but also really hits the hole hard. And I think he does everything they need in that run game. And especially when you've got other weapons around him. When I was talking about that triple option idea, when you've got Trey Lance as well, that's only going to open up more holes for Eli Mitchell going forwards. I don't think he's a top 12 option. I don't think he's particularly close to that, but actually as a running back too, I think you may find yourself a gold mine in the rookie draft.
Yeah, I still stand by selling him high right now because of that offense and that backfield. I don't trust it one bit. 1 week you can have a week like this, and next team might not even get 5 carries, 10 carries.
Yeah.
So I will say with Elijah Mitchell, when you compare them to James Robinson or Philip Lindsay to a lesser extent, I would argue that those two are more of a volume-based running back, which is what Rich always doesn't like. Elijah Mitchell have just under 5 yards a carry in this game. He doesn't seem to be that volume-based running back. Yes, volume-based running backs, if you give them 27 carries, probably can rip off a good run. But I think with his profile as well, you see a lot more to Elijah Mitchell's game. I quite like Mitchell for not a volume-based running back, but I see your point with the draft capital.
Yeah, the worry for me is that they traded up for Sermon and they really liked him as a prospect, and Sermon has done bits and pieces occasionally when he's not a healthy scratch. It worries me that they may potentially be tied to the draft capital of Sermon and look to get him more involved going forwards, even though Mitchell has clearly been the better running back one on the field.
So moving on to the spotlight player of the week. This is a guy that I put in here as a a maybe option, and you were like, yes, let's do this guy. So Hunter Renfro, yes, Waller left the game halfway through, but I really like Hunter Renfro again for more of a flex option. He seems to be getting those PPR targets. They call him third and Renfro because on third down, Carr looks for him, not Waller, who is probably the most dynamic player on third downs. Renfro is picking up those third downs for their Raiders. So he had 9 targets for 8 receptions and 134 yards. That's a lot for a guy that apparently only gets looked at for third downs. This is kind of the role that we were hoping, or a lot of the community were hoping Bryan Edwards would go into. But we're seeing right now that this isn't the case, and it's Renfro's role.
Yeah, I really, really like Renfro at the moment. I've liked him since the beginning of the season. I actually drafted him in a few places and have picked him up where I can. He's only had 2 games under 10 points this season. I don't actually think he's had a game over 20 points. Oh no, except the last one was his first game over 20 points this season. That's what you're going to see from Renfro. And the similar argument that I spoke about with Kendrick Bourne of he's a really reliable weapon for the quarterback. The third and Renfro thing has stuck since college. That's since Clemson. So, he was one of Trevor Lawrence's favorites as well. But he's a really, really reliable weapon that's developed a lot, like the route running that we're seeing posted all over Twitter. Anytime he does a weird triple move for a touchdown, you're going to see such a stable floor from Renfro, and I think that's going to stick. Be interesting to see what they do this offseason with the wide receiver position, because obviously the Ruggs incident, Edwards not really developing the way we wanted him to. Djax is obviously only there until the end of the season. So after this season, you're really only looking at Renfro and Waller as reliable weapons. So it may be that they look to draft someone or bring someone in free agency, in which case Renfro goes back more to the slot and sees slightly less targets if there's other options there. But again, for your wide receiver 3 position, for your flex spot, having a stable floor of 10 points is fantastic.
Yeah, he is definitely that consistent option. So, Lewis, that concludes the pod this week. How have you felt that's gone? Because I know that this is, I believe, your second or third pod. It's not that many in.
No, it's my second pod with you guys, and I think it's only my third ever podcast, or maybe third or fourth overall. But as I was talking to you about beforehand, this is just my favorite thing to sit and talk about. So I don't really tend to get nervous, because especially sitting and talking with someone like you, that I'm really happy to just, it's like we're sat over a pint with a football on in the background. I'm really, really happy sitting and talking about these things. It's nice as well, obviously, having my operation recently, I've been out of the game a little bit. So nice to sit down and really talk some Dynasty with you.
Well, hopefully that's kickstarted you back, and that operation, as you've spoken to us, has gone well. So hopefully you get back into the game a lot more. I would say hopefully the Rams get better after last week, but that means that you're chasing us in the playoff race. So I'm going to leave you with that one. So, guys, that has been the 5 Yard Dynasty podcast. Now, it's been a little bit different with a different host, but I hope you enjoyed it. As usual, the Dynasty podcast is brought to you by Manscaped. So that is 5 Yard for 20% off and free worldwide shipping. And we will see you next week. Thank you, everyone.